I'm joined by Professor Gerard Casey, the former head of the School of Philosophy in UCD and Associate Scholar of Mises Institute and long-term member of the Free Speech Union. We'll be discussing the recent push towards censorship by the EU and Irish-based NGOs, Zelensky's visit to Ireland, and the current pushes towards peace in the Ukraine. I'm Alex Sheridan, and this is Ireland Reports. Well, welcome to the studio, Gerard. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much, Alex. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Well, I think the front-of-mind conversation I'd like to have with you is you're probably best known in Irish political circles for your standing up for free speech and being a champion of such. And you and me have worked on such before, especially surrounding the Irish hate speech bill. And recently, in the last few months and in the last few days as well, we've seen a greater push from the EU towards censorship. The biggest standout piece of news being the €120 million fine, which is leveled towards X, formerly known as Twitter, for not censoring their users enough. And then yesterday we had the US Undersecretary of State, Sarah B. Rogers, criticizing MEP Helmut Brandstatter for saying that there is no censorship in the EU and Americans just need to keep to their own business. It's a very funny clip. Let's roll that clip.
A few moments ago, a German woman notoriously received a harsher jail sentence than a convicted rapist after the woman called the rapist, quote, a disgraceful pig. This was after he participated, along with several other disgraceful pigs, in the gang rape of a 15-year-old girl in a public park. Similarly, a British woman was dragged out of her bath by 11 police officers after she referred in a private text message to a man who allegedly violently assaulted her as, quote, a and victims of violent crime aren't the only people who lack free speech rights in Europe. In Sweden, an activist called Rasmus Paludan was jailed after he burned a Quran and referred to Islam as gay Islam. Finally, in Germany, a man faced a criminal investigation for referring to Green Party leader Ricarda Lang as, quote, fat. There are many more. I could go on, but it's important to note that the European censorship bureaucracy often postures as populist, fighting against big tech. Yet none of the people I listed as a large tech company. These are ordinary Europeans and one Brit who were punished by their governments for saying what they thought was true, or just what they felt like saying. In a free society, that shouldn't happen. So which is it, Mr. Brandstatter? Is there no censorship in Europe, or do we all have to follow your rules?
So what do you think of that, Gerard?
It's astonishing. The level of unself-reflection is absolutely staggering. But the ironic thing is, I think, Alex, is that they genuinely, the Europeans genuinely believe that they actually have free speech and are not limiting it. And that's because they have a tradition that's different from the Anglophone world, where for long before we've ever had the EU and so on, they would have had very, very strict laws about insulting policemen and things like this. So that things that we would take for granted, that you could call somebody a complete idiot and an ignoramus and so on, which would be regarded as either correct or as vulgar abuse, would be regarded as insulting language and be either a civil or very often a criminal offence. So that there's a different understanding at work here. I mean, some may well be, self-deceiving, but it's clearly very, very bizarre when the instances that Sarah Rogers mentions come up and they say, "Oh no, we have free speech," and you think, "Really? That's it?"
Yeah.
It's quite bizarre. But even in our next door neighbour, I mean, the one that's closest to us in the UK, in their Malicious Communications Act, for example, if you post something or put something up on Twitter, on X, and you can have the police arrive at your door. I mean, in fact, there's an old joke going around that if you're burgled, the best thing to do is to put up a tweet like that, because it's the only way you can get the police to come to your door. They won't come for anything else.
Yeah, and we're seeing this in the UK, even though it pins itself as this bastion of democracy and old school liberal values, that they are now arresting more people per year than Russia and China combined for speech-related offences. Wow. Now, I guess we do have to caveat in saying that a lot of these do not result in custodial sentences and rarely result in convictions themselves. But that still has a big chilling effect and does seem quite hypocritical.
Well, yeah, and as you and I, as we've noticed here during the attempt to push the hate speech bill through, in many cases the process is the punishment. So even just having can you imagine the trauma for a normal law-abiding citizen to have the cops arrive on your door, your neighbours are seeing the squad car outside with the flashing lights, and they're wondering what kind of criminal activity have you been up to, and even if nothing results and you're not brought to court, or even if you are and you're not convicted, you're still being punished. And so what will you think of the next time you're tempted to make some remark that might conceivably be considered by the authorities as being hostile or malicious or vindictive or whatever it might be? The answer is you won't. You won't say it. And that is precisely what you refer to as the chilling effect. You will self-censor. And that, of course, is ideal, because there isn't any legal regime which could actually punish everybody who transgressed in a particular area. The law only works even to the minimal extent that it does, because most people are instinctively law-abiding. And if you can induce a chilling atmosphere, you've got what you wanted. All you need are a few exemplary cases, and everybody else will self-censor.
Yeah, I agree on that. And I believe another consequence of this is you're seeing that some of the language policing and censorship is being outsourced to private organizations in the same way a lot of other things get outsourced via the EU. And we might say that the recent fine towards X, the 120 million euro for not censoring their users enough, is an instance of the EU not being happy with censorship not happening enough on their platform. We do see over in the US that when Elon Musk bought X, formerly known as Twitter, and made it a much freer platform for expression, even the likes of Mark Zuckerberg of Meta started instituting a lot of systems to be more reflective of X, and highly admired the Twitter note scheme, for example. So it's not like institutional fact checkers or fact checking stuff. It's a system done off by users who go, oh, hey, this is factually wrong, and it's not biased one way or another. So what do you think of the fine towards X, and do you think that where the way America's trending is different to the EU in terms of having a freer social media?
I think you have to go back a little while, because you have to see this in the context of media generally. If you think about it, newspapers have been around effectively for about 200, 250 years maximum, and they have been for most people, certainly people of my age, would have been the primary means by which you were aware of what was going on in the world, right? But they actually had a gatekeeping function, because, of course, even if they weren't malign, okay, that's making a big presumption, certain things got in and certain things didn't get in. And then, of course, when the electronic media came in other words, when you had radio and television, explicitly, they were state functions. They were set up and organized and run as state entities, and that's still the case for example, RTE in Ireland and the BBC. And so the news that we got was heavily filtered anyway. And what has happened is that with the internet, okay, that I wish I could say that word, that gatekeeping function has been blasted. And so you and I both use the internet. You know, there's a lot of rubbish on the internet. And so one of the first things you learn is not to believe everything you see or hear on the internet unless you can source it elsewhere. But that, of course, demands of us a certain responsibility as a reader. That was done to some extent, say, by book publishers or newspaper editors in the past. And so people sort of relied on the paper to be more or less correct. That's no longer there. But it means that human beings themselves have to take responsibility. What the EU is doing, or wants to do, is to reinstate the gatekeeping function, where they will be the gatekeepers, where they will be the ones who will determine what is and what isn't permitted speech. And I'm totally and completely opposed to that.
Yeah, and I would say that the EU often tends to have, I guess, their lackeys, or is the biggest misnomer in history, but these NGOs who tend to push for these gatekeeping policies to come back. And I guess the most notorious that we know in Ireland is probably the Hope and Courage Collective, who constantly push for stricter restrictions on things like misinformation, or have been supportive of quote unquote hate speech laws for the last few years. Most recently, actually, the Irish Hope and Courage Collective collectively published a report with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, which is a British-based NGO which has received in the past funding from George Soros-aligned organizations. And within their report, they said that there was widespread misinformation spread by the Spoil the Vote campaign prior to the presidential election in Ireland. Now, when you read into their report, you could only find 172 instances of misinformation across all social media platforms. Now, that sounds like a little bit of a red herring to me, and a little bit typical of how they tend to get onto these papers and make a whole big fuss of this. But what do you think of that?
Well, I'm familiar with the ISD because I've seen their stuff and I've looked into their website, and I mean, their supporting institutions are astonishing. I mean, it seems that every right-thinking person in the world and every right-thinking institution, and by right I mean correct, I don't mean on the right, because typically they're not. Lots of governmental institutions, lots of NCOs support them. I'm not familiar with the Hope and Courage Foundation, but I'm not at all surprised that that's the case. These people simply don't like the idea that that news or information might sort of wander freely, and that individuals might take, and in fact might be forced to take, responsibility for what they believe. Look, you and I live in this world. We know that there are headbangers everywhere. There are people out there who believe the most wonderfully strange and bizarre things. So what? Okay, but most people have now got to the stage with the internet where they now tend to rely on it for a different view. Many people, of course, want simply to have their views validated, and so they follow sources that reinforce what they believe. But I mean, I can remember when I first started to use X, which was actually quite recent, and I immediately fell into the trap of a parody account. Okay, I didn't realize it was a parody account, but within minutes, people pointed out to me that it was a parody account, and so A, it was corrected very, very quickly, and B, I learned to be a little bit more careful. So when I come across something that seems so utterly fantastic as to be unbelievable, I tend not to believe it until I can verify it from another thing. And that I would think is the responsibility of citizens everywhere. You should be doing that. That's what you should be doing. And it isn't anybody else's responsibility, by the way, to look out for you if you're an adult. Okay, it's not anybody else's job. But of course, our betters in the EU see it as precisely their job, and to control the flow of information. And they would like to shut down or to control places like X, especially X, whatever about the other electronic media. But X is their big bugbear, I think.
Yeah, and it doesn't just extend to levying of fines against organizations that don't fall into line with their point of view. The Council of Europe most recently, or their anti-racism body, 2 months ago, called for Ireland to introduce new measures to combat hate speech again. So it does seem to be a bit undead, the hate speech bill. Just when we think that it's dead, they're trying to revive it, like necromancy.
Well, I was going to say, it's like a vampire that hasn't had a stake driven through its heart.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, it just kind of keeps getting up, and you have to keep, or like somebody once said that something, I can't remember what the saying was, that there are some dead horses that need to be flogged repeatedly. When you think they've been flogged to death, they rise up again. And I'm not at all surprised that we're getting a pushback on this. The defeat, because that's the only thing you can call it, of the Irish hate speech bill is something that really rankles in Irish political circles, and it hasn't made the Irish government look good in the eyes of their peers and superiors in Europe, and therefore we can expect it, as it were, to come back again at some stage in the future, probably better packaged and more palatable in some way, but nonetheless the same effective restrictions will be in there and so on, and we'll have to fight it all over again.
Yeah, maybe so. Hopefully, though, with the recent administration in America, I don't think you have to be partisan towards one side or the other, just to acknowledge the fact that they have made communications to the Irish government that if there is attempts by the likes of Commission Demand to censor American organizations over here, or if there is oversteps in measures to censor people in Ireland, that there will be consequences stateside.
Good.
Ireland does a lot of business with the US and the EU, and is going to have to find a balance with that. Yeah. And we have seen some positive comments from Jim O'Callaghan. He was asked in the Dáil a couple of months ago, are you going to bring round 2 of the hate speech bill? And he goes, it's not on the agenda as of now. So I think we can breathe a sigh of relief, at least for the time being.
Yeah, but keep your guard up.
Keep the guard up and always remain watchful. Speaking of the Dáil, or ministers in the Dáil, we this week, there's also a bit of news that we had Volodymyr Zelensky visit the Dáil and do a speech within it. And then we had 120 million euro, 125 million euro was pledged by the Irish government to support Ukraine. We have a clip of Zelensky visiting the Dáil and giving a speech. Let's have a look at that now.
We need real peace. Help us achieve it and never lose your faith in Ukraine. Thank you, Ireland. Glory to Ukraine.
I think today's visit really it's an opportunity for us to reiterate our unwavering support for Ukraine, but also to stress that we want to see Europe's support increase even further, not just politically, but in terms of the financial support. And again, today we will be repledging 100 million euro as well as 25 million euro towards that critical infrastructure and that rebuilding that really needs to happen now, not any time in the future.
So what do you think of that now, Gerard?
Oh, well, there's our old mate Helen McEntee of the hate speech bill, okay, reappearing again to tell us we must do more. And the question I've been asking, because since the war broke out between the Ukraine and Russia, I've stayed out of it completely because I know this sounds bizarre, but I must be one of the few people in the world who says it's not my business, right? I mean, there are wars going on all over the world. There are lots of wars going on in Africa. We don't hear anything about it. We don't hear the Irish government saying we stand with and then naming one side or the other. And I'm going, well, it's not that I don't care that there are wars. I do. I mean, it's regrettable that people are being killed and injured and property is being damaged. But not everything that goes on in the world is my business, and not everything that goes on in the world is or should be the business of the Irish government. And I remarked sarcastically, one of my few interventions was to ask sarcastically when the Irish declaration of war on Russia had been made, because I must have missed it. Okay, and that goes, by the way, for France and Germany and all the other countries, and Britain, supplying one side in a war. And there comes a time, by the way, when this moves over from money and supplies to advisors. We saw this, for example, with the Americans in the Far East. And before you know it, you've got a war. And one of the things that should be obvious from what's gone on between Russia and Ukraine is that it's very easy to start a war. It's remarkably difficult to stop. And I deprecate this war. I think it's very unfortunate, but I think of it as a war between neighbours, between Slavic neighbours, between two countries that share traditions. And the boundaries and the borderline thing is not something in which I'm an expert. I must again been one of the few people who instantly, when war was declared, didn't become an expert in East European matters and boundaries and the history of Russia and the Ukraine. And I was commissioned to write an article for Gript recently, which I wrote largely in response to von der Leyen's claim that borders can't be changed by force. I pointed out and included a moving map of Ukraine to show that its boundaries have changed consistently over the last 500 or 600 years. And indeed, the Ukraine should be well aware that their northwestern border is a disputed area between themselves and Poland. Now, I'm not taking sides and I'm not justifying the war, okay? But I'm just saying I don't see why it's our business and why we seem to be, and indeed why the EU, particularly France and Germany, and indeed Britain, seem to be anxious to effectively either participate in a war or, much more worryingly, to start a war with Russia.
It is very worrying and very sad as well that you mentioned that these are two Slavic countries that they used to have a very good relationship with each other. It was only in 1991, during the dissolution of the Soviet Union, when it was attempting to become a new sort of EU sort of style bloc of Slavic states, so to speak, that 81% of Ukrainians voted for independence for Ukraine, but also join a union with Russia for something going forward. That fell apart because then there was the coup in Russia and Gorbachev was deposed, and at that point the Ukrainians go, well, Russia's not stable, we're just going to do our own thing. But then, fast forward, only 20 years later, just over 20 years later, 2014, you did have the initial invasion. And a lot of people would point out that might have been from a bit of provocation from America, possibly involving itself in the Ukraine protests at the time. But what do you say to that? Do you think a lot of this war is because of maybe European and American influences maybe poking the bear that is Russia?
Yes, the short answer is yes. Look, again, I'm not an expert, and even if not everything I read about this online is true, it certainly does seem to be the case that the NATO and some previous U.S. administrations have been attempting, as it were, to push the boundaries of U.S. and NATO influence eastwards towards Russia. Now, look. Russia has had experience in the last 200 years of large-scale invasions, one from France in the early 19th century and one from Germany in the earlier part of the 20th century. And they are, to some extent, I wouldn't say paranoid, because paranoid is an irrational fear, but there are grounds for being afraid. And I mean, if you think about it, I mean, I'm old enough to have lived through the missile crisis in Cuba. And I remember, I was 11 or 12 at the time. I can remember the United States getting very upset about the idea that would be Soviet missiles stationed in Cuba, okay, some 80 or 90 or 100 miles off its coast. So you can understand why, again, I'm not justifying, but I can understand why a country, whatever you think of its leader and however corrupt it may be, and by the way, there's a large contest in corruption between Russia and the Ukraine for first place, okay? But nonetheless, you can understand why they would be concerned about having something move that close to their border. And then there's the eternal issue, which has been around certainly since the post-World War I a solution, when all the new countries came into being from the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire and the German Empire. Part of it led to the Second War with the Sudeten Germans in what was Bohemia, now Czechia. The shift westwards of Poland, the move of Russia and others into what was then Prussia, the alienation of about 1/3 of Hungarian territory. I mean, when you look at the history, recent history within the last 100 years, you'll see not only is it the case that boundaries cannot be changed, but they actually have changed quite dramatically. And again, I'm not an expert. I'm not taking sides. It seems to me that it's an issue for Russia and the Ukraine to decide. It would have been a whole lot better if they had been able to decide it without violence and warfare and the resultant deaths and destruction, but they haven't. And again, I don't know why we are interfering, because that's what it is. And if I was Russia, I'd be taking a very dim view of this, especially for future relations, interfering in what seems to be somebody else's fight.
Yeah, but I do think we do need to point out that something that is factual, despite maybe well-founded fears and possible provocations from the West, this was a Russian-initiated war. And something that does stand out to me with Ukraine as opposed to other Western wars, like with Iraq, the Vietnam War, or Afghanistan, is when the supposed side of democracy is armed by the West and trained and given all sorts of weapons. When they are left on their own without Western boots being on the ground, they just fall apart. In Afghanistan, they flee in the face of the Taliban. In Iraq, in the face of ISIS, Iraqi soldiers were literally stripping out of their uniforms so they couldn't be identified when ISIS came into the territory.
Yeah.
One thing to acknowledge is the Ukrainians actually fight.
Yep.
So they do want to remain independent. And I always think that should be acknowledged. And I'm sure you would agree with that.
No, I don't deny that. And I don't deny in any sense that the Russians were the ones who initiated the actual conflict. Okay, that would be just simply counterfactual. But when you judge to the extent to which this is justified in some sense to settle long-term problems, you have to recognize that there are long-term problems that needed to be solved. I deprecate the violence. I'm a libertarian. I'm not a pacifist, but I think that one should be very careful before one initiates any kind of violence, because one is likely to find oneself on the wrong side if one is not careful.
I agree with that. And we are seeing some major pushes from the Trump administration towards peace in Ukraine. They put out a plan which some in Europe are saying which is capitulation. I think it is not at all, considering that Russia's initial aims were to complete regime change within Kyiv and to almost take over the entire country, whereas now it is just the Donbass region, which and Crimea, which is more or less minimalist in terms of their demands. Now, Ireland is donating 125 million euro. I think maybe we could put up a a news story from Ivana Bacik, or a quote from Ivana Bacik on screen, where, Ivana Bacik was criticizing the government for abandoning disabled people and carers in Budget 2026. Speaking during leaders' questions in the Dáil, Deputy Bacik said that the budget represented handouts for burger barons and big builders, but broken promises for everyone else. So when we don't have enough money to give to carers, surely we haven't money to be given away to foreign countries involved in a war which don't ostensibly involve us.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I pointed this out on my own Twitter feed that this seems to be absurd. There's a principle here. If you accept that governments have a role, and I don't, because I'm an anarchist, right? I don't accept the legitimacy of governments at all. But if you assume as the status quo that they're there, their only justification is that their job is to advance the welfare of their citizens, right? So it would seem to me to be self-evident that a government should not be doing anything with the money in its possession, which generally has obtained from taxpayers, until the needs, especially the exigent needs of its citizens, are met. And when you have, I wouldn't normally find myself on the same side as Ivana Bacik, but when you have Irish citizens who don't have housing and who don't have medicine, whose children are ill and not taken care of, okay, and when money that could be going there is going elsewhere, it seems to me we've got our priorities wrong. It's not, again, that I in any way reject the idea that there are Ukrainian people who need assistance and so on and so forth. But in fact, over the last 3 or 4 years, Ireland as a country has done enormous in taking in an enormous number of Ukrainians and supporting them here. So it's not like we haven't done anything, and this is the first time.
I think it's the highest per capita in Europe, other than Poland.
Yeah, and it's quite striking. So but that 100, I mean, it is a bit galling. I mean, I'm thankfully, I mean, my children don't need anything. But if I was a parent with a very sick child who needed, say, specialized medical attention, and they couldn't get it because of the waiting list, and I think the Irish taxpayers' money is going to another country, effectively to support a war, I'd be a little cross about that.
I can definitely understand that. Well, I think we might leave that there, Gerard. Thank you very much for joining us in the studio today.
Not at all. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you to our viewers. This has been Ireland Reports. If you'd like to support the channel, please hit the subscribe button. If you like this video, please like it. Liking the video helps suggest the video to other viewers. Also, if you'd like to support the channel financially, please hit us up on buymeacoffee.com.